He searched for hands to hold a broom and bucket, but what he asked for was silence. What he found was the first breath his heart had taken in years. The house stood on the rise like a hollow chest. Its beams groaned, its shelves wore coats of dust, and pale light spilled onto the wooden floorboards. The morning was cold, though the sun had risen long ago. In the kitchen, the air carried the scent of stale bread and iron. He poured water from the barrel, dropped the ladle, bent down slowly to pick it up. Each sound echoed too loudly, as if in a church after the service had ended. He had lived like this for years. One chair at the table, one plate, one spoon, one blanket that never had to be shared. Dust lifted its head from every corner, no matter how often he brushed it away with his sleeve. He could mend a fence, clean a stable, carry heavy loads. But the house did not listen to his hands. The house required something else, some quiet, stubborn care that was not about the work itself, but about breathing life into it. He pulled on a weathered, dark coat, adjusted the brim of his bent hat, hesitated at the door, and stepped outside anyway. His horse tossed its head, the bit clinking. The road to town stretched in ruts and pale dust, 2 hours of silence. He rode with no words, his trail marking the earth like an old scar. Around his neck hung a brass key. He touched it sometimes, as though to remind himself there was still something inside that needed guarding. The store in town smelled of salt and iron. On the wall hung the notice board, torn edges, scribbled hands, trades and pleas. He stood in the doorway a long moment. From his coat pocket he pulled a folded sheet. He had written it slowly, carving each letter with effort so it would not betray his unease. Housekeeper needed, lodging and bread provided, honest work, farm 3 miles north of the Dry Willow, monthly pay, ask for the farmer. He found a bare patch, pressed the page against the wood, and hammered it in with 3 short blows. The sound was sharp and final, carrying through the store. With each strike, he felt something slip from his shoulders, like the cold that always waited behind his door, the kind that clung to him like a loyal dog. He stepped back, read the words once more, and left his mark at the bottom. 2 crossing lines, the way locals knew him. The notice hung there for days. The ink faded a little where the sun struck it. People passed, glanced, moved on. A few laughed under their breath. A farmer asking for a housekeeper was nothing new. Most men in that country wanted more than bread and dust swept from their floors. But she stopped. She looked thinner than the journey should have allowed. Clothes worn from travel, boots cracked at the seams. Her hair was tied, but loose strands clung to her cheeks. She read the words slowly, pressing her lips together, as if tasting the offer for something hidden beneath it. She traced the 2 crossed lines at the bottom, the mark of a man who did not sign his name. That made her linger. She had come to town with no plan but escape. A small satchel hung from her shoulder, too light for comfort, too heavy with the last of her pride. Behind her, voices rattled the air, men calling, horses snorting, the creak of wagons. She kept her eyes down. A woman alone invited questions she could not afford to answer. She returned to the notice. Honest work, lodging, bread. She thought of nights on the road when the cold pressed against her ribs and the earth itself felt like stone against her bones. She thought of mornings when she woke with her throat dry and her hands trembling from hunger. The words on that page were simple, but simple was a gift. She touched the edge of the paper, not enough to tear it, only enough to leave a smudge where her fingers rested. A storekeeper behind the counter watched her. He knew the man who had left that notice. He also knew silence when he saw it. He said nothing. When she left the store, her steps were uneven, but her jaw was set. The road north lay waiting, and though her body sagged under the weight of it, her eyes held on. She did not pray, but her hand brushed the cross stitched into her satchel strap, the one that kept loosening, but she always sewed back. The willow stood dead, gray and bent over a dry creek bed. Beyond it, the land stretched wide, hard, and open. A figure waited in the distance, horse tethered, coat long and dark. He did not move until she came closer. He did not wave. He only stood, a shape against the dust, watching as she walked, slow and stubborn, toward the house that had called her without a name. The sky had turned pale. With evening, when she reached the ridge, the horse, tied near the gate, raised its head, snorted, and stamped the ground. The man stood by the fence, shoulders broad beneath his worn coat, hat brim shadowing his eyes. He did not move to greet her. He only watched, as steady as the land itself. She slowed, each step dragging through dust that clung to her hem. Her satchel strap cut into her shoulder. She paused at the gate, uncertain if it was hers to open. He stepped forward then, lifted the latch, and let it swing inward. Still no words. Only a nod, small, almost hidden, yet enough to tell her she had not come in vain. The yard bore the marks of long work. Tools leaned against the wall. Firewood was stacked unevenly by the door. The barn loomed dark and heavy. Chickens scattered at her approach, wings beating. She glanced at the house. Its windows looked like tired eyes, half clouded with grime. She thought of the word from the notice, housekeeper, and understood what it meant. He walked ahead, boots striking firm. She followed, her own steps softer, as if afraid to leave marks. He pushed open the door and held it long enough for her to pass. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of smoke that lingered from fires long gone cold. A single chair, a table scarred by years of use, shelves where cobwebs ruled. He placed a small loaf on the table, wrapped in cloth, a jug of water beside it. Then he left her there, disappearing into the barn without a word. The silence he carried was heavy, but not unkind. She sank into the chair, her legs trembling from the road. She unwrapped the bread slowly, as if it might vanish if she rushed. Her first bite was small, her eyes closing as she chewed. She had eaten little on the trail. Here, even stale bread felt like mercy. She wiped her hands on her dress, rose, and opened the shutter. Evening light spilled in, golden and sharp, stirring the dust into a soft haze. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe as though she might stay. Morning broke gray and brittle. A thin frost clung to the fence rails, melting slow under the first light. He was already outside, splitting wood in the yard, his coat set aside, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The crack of the axe rang sharp, steady as breath. Inside, she moved carefully through the rooms. The dust lay thick on the shelves, soft on the floorboards, draped over the corners like forgotten cloth. She lifted a rag from her satchel, wetted it from the jug, and began to wipe. Her motions were slow at first, tracing the outlines of objects, pots, jars, a crooked picture frame. Each pass of her hand cleared a patch of wood, and the house seemed to stir with it. She filled a bucket from the pump. The handle squealed, cold water spilling over her hands. She carried it in both arms, leaving dark trails on the floorboards. On her knees, she scrubbed until her palms burned. The air thickened with the smell of soap and damp wood. By midday, the gray haze that had clung to the house was lifting. Light struck the table, clearer than before. When he came in, boots heavy with dirt, he stopped in the doorway. He did not speak. His eyes swept the room. The cleared shelves, the table wiped clean, the faint shine of boards where her rag had passed. She stood by the window, catching her breath, one hand gripping the sill to steady herself. Their eyes met for a moment, only a moment, and he gave a single nod before moving past her. He set a sack of flour on the table. The weight of it thudded against the wood. Without a word, he pushed it closer to her side. A gift or a gesture of thanks. It was hard to say. She touched the sack, her fingers brushing the rough fabric. That evening, as the sun folded itself into the hills, she lit a small lamp. The flame flickered against the freshly cleaned glass. She sat at the table, breaking bread into a bowl, listening to the sounds outside. The horse shifting in the barn, the man's boots on the dirt. The house no longer felt hollow. It breathed with her effort, with his silence, with the fragile thread that had begun to stretch between them. The days settled into rhythm. He worked the fields and the barn. She moved through the house with rag and bucket, her hands raw from lye and wood. Neither spoke much. The silence stretched long but did not feel hostile. It carried the weight of two lives worn thin by years, now brushing against each other like strangers on a narrow path. One evening, the wind rose hard from the north. The door rattled, the shutters banged. He stacked wood inside, laid it by the hearth. His hands were cracked, the nails dark with earth. She knelt by the fireplace, coaxing a flame from tinder. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, catching the glow. The fire grew steady, orange light spilling across the rough floorboards. He sat in the single chair, elbows on his knees, head lowered. She laid another log, sat back on her heels, and rested her palms on the warm stone. For a while, neither moved. The only sound was the fire's breath and the wind clawing at the roof. After a time, he stood, crossed the room, and returned with a second chair. It was old, leg uneven, dust clinging to the backrest. He set it across from his own, pushed it gently forward. She looked at him, surprised, then lowered herself into it. The wood creaked beneath her weight. They sat like that, fire between them, shadows thrown long on the walls. She folded her hands in her lap, still marked red from scrubbing. He watched the flames, eyes hooded, face carved in stillness. No words passed, yet the air shifted, less empty, more bearable. When the lamp went out, she rose, carried her bowl to the basin, and rinsed it clean. He took the bucket outside, returned with fresh water. Their steps crossed without collision, each task done without command. The house felt different that night. Warmer, not because of the fire alone, but because two chairs now stood at the hearth where one had been for too many years. The weeks edged forward, quiet as falling ash. The farm grew tidier under her hands. The shelves lost their dust, the windows cleared. The smell of soap lingered in corners once sour with neglect. He noticed but never spoke of it. His way of thanks was leaving flour, salt, or wood stacked neatly by the door. But she carried more than weariness. Some nights she woke with a start, chest rising too fast, breath catching like a snare. She would sit on the edge of her bed, palms pressed to her knees, staring at the dark. In those hours, the silence of the farm felt heavier than any town's noise. One dawn, he found her outside, sitting on the step in her thin shawl, eyes hollow. He did not ask. He only set a tin cup beside her, steam rising from it. Coffee, black and bitter. She lifted it with trembling hands, drank slow, and did not thank him. But her shoulders eased just enough to show she understood. Later, in the barn, he worked the horse's bridle, the leather stiff beneath his fingers. She entered quietly, carrying fresh straw. For a long while they moved together without words, the rhythm of work binding them closer than speech. He saw the way she favored one side, how her body bore some hidden wound. He did not name it. She saw the way his eyes darkened when he stared too long at the hills, the memory of something buried out there. She did not press. One afternoon she washed linens in the creek. The water was sharp with spring melt, numbing her wrists. She wrung each cloth, spread them on the line. He passed by, carrying fence posts on his shoulder. Their eyes met for the briefest flicker. He nodded once, as if to say he saw her burden even if she would not tell it. That evening, the wind fell still. They sat again by the fire. She folded her hands around a small carving knife, whittling a scrap of wood he had left on the table. The shape was nothing yet, only shavings curling at her feet. But it was something to hold, something to make her hands remember she was still alive. He watched without intruding. She let him. In that silence, their pasts sat between them, heavy but no longer unbearable. Spring softened the edges of the land. Grass pushed through old frost, and the air no longer cut so sharp. He worked the fields, steady and unyielding, his hands roughened by soil and wood. She tended the house, the fire, the small order that had taken root. The silence between them grew less hollow, more like space that allowed breath. One morning, she woke earlier than him. The sky was still gray, the rooster not yet calling. She set the flour on the table, measured water into the bowl, worked the dough with aching fingers. It stuck to her palms, clung to the creases of her skin. She kneaded until her arms trembled, then laid the loaf near the hearth to rise. By the time he stepped inside, sweat darkening his shirt from chores, the smell had filled the room. Warm, alive, something the house had not known in years. He stopped in the doorway, his chest lifting once, sharp. She pulled the loaf from the iron pot, set it on the table, the crust crackling. For a long moment he only looked at it, then at her. She placed a knife beside it, clean and sharp. He lowered himself into the chair, cut the bread, and pushed the first piece across the table to her. She hesitated, then took it, fingers brushing the rough wood. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, as though the bread itself was fragile. For the first time, the house smelled not of dust or lye, but of something that drew them both to the table. The air carried warmth that went deeper than the fire. She wiped crumbs from the wood, her hands still unsteady, her face softer than he had yet seen it. He leaned back, swallowed, and let his hand rest flat on the table for a moment longer than needed. She saw it, though neither spoke. Outside, the wind moved gentle through the grass, and for once the house felt less like a tomb and more like a place meant to be lived in. The storm came sudden, rolling in from the west with a wall of black clouds. The wind bent the trees until they cracked, and the sky tore open with thunder that shook the ground. He was outside when it broke, dragging tools into the barn, shouting at the horse to settle. Rain struck hard, cold and heavy, flooding the yard in minutes. She stood in the doorway, skirts whipping around her legs, shawl clutched to her chest. When he wrestled the last gate closed, she ran forward, caught the swinging door of the barn with both hands, and pulled against the wind. Her hair lashed across her face, her boots sinking into mud. He saw her there, teeth clenched, fighting the storm as if it were hers to master. Together they forced the door shut. The latch slammed home, and silence filled the barn, except for the pounding rain on the roof. Both stood soaked, water dripping from hair and clothes, breaths loud in the dark. The horse shifted nervously, and she reached for its neck, murmuring words too soft to hear. The animal stilled under her touch. He watched, water tracing down his face as her hand steadied the trembling beast. Lightning flared through the cracks, painting them in white. For a moment, their eyes met, his steady, hers burning with something fierce beneath the exhaustion. No words passed, but something deeper moved in that silence. The storm outside raged, but inside the barn another storm eased. When the worst of it passed, they walked back to the house together. Mud clung to their boots, clothes heavy with rain. He opened the door and she stepped inside, water pooling on the floorboards. Without thinking, he reached for a dry blanket from the peg and placed it around her shoulders. She froze for a breath, then pulled it close. That night, the wind still moaned, but the house no longer shook. They sat near the fire, steam rising from their clothes, the blanket drawn around her, his coat drying nearby. Two lives, weathered and scarred, sat side by side. Not bound by promise, not yet by word, but by the quiet knowledge that storms could be faced together. The storm left the land quiet, washed clean. Puddles filled the ruts in the yard. The air smelled of damp earth. He mended the fence where the wind had torn it down, steady strokes of the hammer ringing sharp. She moved through the house, opening windows, letting the damp air roll through. That evening, when work was done, they sat on the step outside. The sun sank low, painting the fields in gold. He held his pocket knife, the blade worn from years. In silence, he bent over the railing of the porch and carved slow, careful strokes. She watched his hand move, the shavings falling into his lap. When he leaned back, the wood bore two small marks, his familiar crossed lines, and beneath them another set, rough but deliberate, the first letter of her name. He did not speak, only rested the knife on his knee. She stared at the letters, her breath caught. No one had written her name in years, not on paper, not on wood, not anywhere. She lifted her hand, traced the grooves with her finger. The wood was rough, the cuts shallow, but her touch lingered there as if it were the most fragile thing she had ever been given. He did not look at her. His gaze stayed on the horizon, where the sky deepened into red. But his hand remained still beside the carving, the knife resting loose, as though waiting for her to claim the space. The silence was long, heavy, but not empty. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, leaned back against the railing, and let the air fill her chest. In that simple act, two letters cut into tired wood, the dust that had clung to her heart began to lift. She did not thank him. She only stayed seated when the sun dropped, when the fields darkened, when the stars blinked awake. The house behind them no longer looked abandoned. It looked lived in, because someone's name had been carved into its bones. Summer crept in, slow and steady. The fields stretched green, the barn stood solid, and the house, once hollow, now carried the sound of footsteps that did not echo alone. The air smelled of bread, soap, and wood smoke, not dust. The shutters no longer rattled. The windows let in the sun. She rose early, her dress faded but clean, her hands steady as she worked the hearth. He came in from the yard with buckets of water, setting them by the door without a word. Their movements crossed in quiet rhythm, each task folded into the other. That evening they shared a meal at the table. Not much: bread, beans, coffee. But when she placed the dishes, she did not set one plate. She set two. And when he sat down, he did not eat as a man filling silence. He ate as one who knew someone else was across from him. Afterward, he walked outside, stood by the porch railing where the carving remained. His hand brushed the letters, his mark and hers, side by side. She joined him, a shawl draped over her shoulders, hair loose in the warm wind. For a long while they stood, not speaking, only watching the horizon fade into dusk. Then, without turning, he pulled the knife once more, pressed it to the wood, and carved a final stroke. The mark was small, almost hidden, but she saw it. Their two signs joined together in one place, hers no longer alone, his no longer apart. Her throat tightened, but no words came. Instead, she rested her hand on the wood, fingers overlapping his. He did not pull away. The night rose around them, carrying the sound of crickets, the creak of the barn, the steady breath of the land. The house behind them stood no longer as a shell, but as a home. Not built on contracts or promises, but on bread shared, chairs placed by the fire, names cut into wood, and the dust cleared from two tired hearts.